Velkommen til en ny episode av Rusrevyen. I dag så blir det enda en episode på engelsk. Sjekk episodebeskrivelsene for hvor du kan finne en oversettelse. Okay. Welcome to this episode of Rusrevyen. Today our guest is Steve Rawls. He is part of it's called Transform.
Transform Drug Policy Foundation.
Yeah. And you're based in
UK.
England, in UK. Maybe, is it offensive for you to, when I say like England instead of the UK?
I'm from England. I live in England,
but
it's also the United Kingdom, and don't want to get too sort of parochial.
Yeah.
But I mean, our organisation operates globally. We're based in the UK, but we have a global mandate and we work internationally.
Yeah. And the reason why we're visiting Norway right now is because you were part of the Nordic Reform Conference yesterday. You both had a very interesting lecture on regulation and how the wind is blowing for regulation all across the world, as well as like being the host for the conference. And you've been here also like several times before for Nordic, and we really appreciate that.
I mean, I do love coming here. The Association for Safer Drug Policy is a fantastic organisation that I've been involved with since they were setting up. And they contacted Transform because we've been around for a few years more.
Yeah,
they
like
contacted
the early
us,
2000s or
1998.
Yeah,
so
it's getting
a
old.
long time. And so when they were setting up, they reached out to Transform, and we provided them with some materials and some sort of some of the experiences we'd had setting up an organisation and how to develop a political strategy, and which they picked it up and ran with it, and they've just done brilliant work in Norway, and I think really helped push the debate forward in Norway, because you can't have drug policy reforms anywhere without sort of local NGO civic activism. The governments just don't seem to want to lead on this. You have to have the people pushing the debate forward, and there was obviously a need for an organisation like the association in Norway, and I think they've filled the gap brilliantly and done just a really, really good job, and really achieved a lot, I think, in Norway. Like the decriminalisation reforms that are happening now almost happened a few years ago, but are now kind of happening now. And the stuff that they're doing with harm reduction and the drug checking, and just really promoting intelligent debate that was missing in this country. So it's been my privilege to be a part of that.
Yeah, I have to say as well, I've been part of Safer Youth for a while, but I feel like proud what these organizations are able to do.
Yeah, I mean, there's 3 or 4 organizations in Norway, and if they weren't here, there would be no debate, and I don't think there would be any reform or change, because the politicians just don't want to lead on it. I mean, it's sort of ironic that we elect our leaders, but they don't lead. Ultimately they follow. They will. The leadership comes from these civic organizations, and it comes from the activists, and it comes from the courageous service providers. I mean, like the association providing drug checking, that's not a legal service. They're just doing it, and they are taking the risks. They are putting themselves in legal jeopardy. They're taking the political flak because our elected politicians don't have the courage to do that. So it comes to these civic organizations, and I think if you look at drug policy historically, it's almost always been that kind of process, a bottom-up process.
Yeah.
The local activists, NGOs, even sometimes local government or local service providers, they take the risks, and they push everything forward. It's never from the UN or from the EU or even from national government, or very rarely anyway.
Yeah. Do you think that's special for drug policy, that the courage is lacking, especially in this area, or is?
I think when you have certain issues which are very emotive, very difficult. I mean, drug policy it's kind of fascinating because on the one hand, intellectually and kind of from a scientific perspective, a drug law reform platform, it's sort of a no-brainer. It's obvious. Well, of course you have an evidence-based public health strategy and not a weird ideological drug war that has failed for 60 years. Why would you keep doing that? It makes no sense, except from a very kind of basic populist political narrative. We are tough on law and order, we're tough on crime, we're tough on drugs, we will protect our children. Politically, those are very powerful narratives. But from a kind of policy, social policy perspective or a science, evidence-based perspective, it's complete nonsense. All of the outcomes that we all want to see, better health, reduced crime, young people protected, human rights protected, shrinking the organized crime networks and all that. From a scientific perspective, it's a total disaster. Every outcome is terrible. The whole point of the war on drugs is to get drugs out of society, to create a drug-free world. And if you look at the history of the war on drugs, we've moved further and further away from that every single year. So its primary goal is we're nowhere near it. In fact, we're getting further away. Drugs are cheaper, they're more available, they're purer, more people are taking them, more people are having addiction problems, there's more drug-related deaths from any and more young people are being exploited. There's more crime, there's more violence. So, the organized crime groups are getting richer and richer. So from any objective, meaningful analysis, total disaster, catastrophic, and not just 1 year, like decades. It's a generational disaster. So how anyone could look at that and go, yeah, let's do that. Let's do more of that. That's good. So it's never been about the data. It's never been about the evidence. It's always been an ideological crusade, a political program, essentially a populist political program. And I think cynical because politicians, they know. They know they're not... I was going to say politicians aren't idiots. Quite a lot of them actually are idiots, but they're not fools. They understand what's going on here, and they do it anyway because it works for them politically. So, I think that the tipping point that we're reaching, the threshold that we're reaching, is that politicians are realizing that the war on drugs is as a political program is running out of steam, and we need now to and it's beginning. Drug law reform is beginning to be a political asset rather than a liability. And the reason that change has happened is because of NGOs and activists and people telling it again and again and again in public, this isn't working. A rational public health approach to drugs makes much better sense. We will have better outcomes. We have better health outcomes. We have better crime outcomes. Young people are protected. Crime goes down. Street violence. Blah blah blah. We make those arguments, and they are getting through. So the political calculus is changing, and I think that is the valuable work that organisations like Save for Youth and the Association and Norway and all of the other organisations doing brilliant work in Norway are changing that political equation. So it no longer works to go, yes, let's throw them all in jail and punish drug users and we'll seize the drugs and that will stop people taking it. It's obvious bullshit. But because we are here and you are here and our colleagues at the association and et cetera, because they are doing that day after day after day, eventually it gets through, and the political equation is changing. And I've just ranted for like 5 minutes. You didn't even ask me a question. You just set me off and I'm sorry. You can ask me some specific questions. I will try not to rant for 10 minutes.
Well, your rants are perfect.
I'm just having a coffee. I'm just a bit over caffeinated. Apologies.
Well, I think you're also very concise the way that you're putting it. Like in your rants, the way that you're presenting it.
You call them rants as well.
Well, you just said it.
My monologue.
Yeah, but they're really. I think they're powerful though. That the way that you're putting it forward. So I think it's important that people hear it. I didn't want to disturb you.
Oh no, but you can. If I'm just just interrupt me.
Takk for at du lytter til podcasten. Hvis du under 30 år og vil støtte oss i kampen for en progressiv ruspolitikk, så må du gjerne bli medlem av Tryggere Ungdom. Det koster 50 kroner for et helt år. Hvis du over 30, kan du bli medlem av Tryggere Ruspolitikk. Setter også stor pris på om du legger igjen en anmeldelse av podcasten, og deler podcasten med dine venner. Da når vi ut til flere. Med det, tilbake til episoden. Earlier, we were talking a little bit about Transform and how it's UK-based, but it's working globally. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, when Transform set up, and it was a long time ago, the focus of Transform was always very much on what a post-prohibition world would look like. There's always been a very, I think, powerful critique of prohibition and the punitive paradigm and the war on drugs, whatever you want to call it. And it felt like there was a consensus building behind that critique. And there was a broad agreement that, because it's hard to argue with, as I just ranted about, it's hard to argue that the war on drugs is failing. The question is, what do you do instead? Because if you don't have a coherent vision of an alternative policy, the danger is that people go, well, we just need more war on drugs. And if we fight the war harder, we put more police, we put more people in prison, we have bigger guns, we will somehow win it ultimately, and if you have a kind of warlike mentality, that does make a certain amount of sense,
It makes a little bit of sense, but at the same time, I think the only time in recent history in Norway where they managed to get less drugs into Norway was during the pandemic when it was so locked down.
Right.
And is that okay? So maybe we can do it if it's that lockdown. But even then, people started growing cannabis here.
Right. Even then, people found a new way, and because supply and demand, the market adapts. And yeah, I mean, in the UK, there was a bit of a sort of shortage of drugs. But then what happened was you had less individual smuggling. You had less individual. You had bigger. I'm sort of trying to what incidents. So people were, instead of smuggling lots of single kilos in suitcases, people were smuggling tons in container ships. So it changed the market. It didn't stop the market. But I suppose the point I was trying to make there is if you frame this issue as a war against an enemy, a bit like fighting the Nazis or invading aliens or something, then almost anything is justified. And if you're failing, what you need is more guns. It's a bit, the Russians are invading Ukraine. If Ukraine had enough weapons, they could fight off the Russians. And if you frame it as a war, people think, well, if we had enough police, we could stop the drugs. But history shows that isn't happening. So we need to move away from this. The war on drugs isn't working because we're not fighting it hard enough. And the war on drugs isn't working because it is fundamentally conceptually flawed. You can't fight reality. It's a bit like trying to stop people having sex by saying we will criminalize sex. And we've done that in the past. People were criminalized for being gay. People were criminalized for having certain types of sex. You can't legislate for human desires and human behaviors. It simply doesn't work. And while the demand is there for drugs and the effects of drugs, whether it's for pleasure, whether it's to relieve pain, whatever reason people have, there is demand, and there always has been throughout history, and there always will be to some degree. The market will find a way to meet that demand because it creates a profit opportunity. You simply can't just eradicate it by force or by violence, which is what the war on drugs attempts to do. So if drug use is a reality and drug markets are a reality one way or another, we have a choice. You either regulate them responsibly in some way, or you leave them in the hands of an illegal market. And the illegal market obviously is a disaster for many obvious reasons. So the work that we've done was to focus on, well, what is the reality of a regulated market look like for cannabis, but for all drugs? Because it's not. One of the things that we've been keen to push is this idea that you don't just regulate the safer drugs, the less threatening drugs like cannabis. And obviously cannabis has risks, but it's also less dangerous than fentanyl, for example. But our view is you need to regulate all drugs, or at least not all preparations of every type of every drug, but you within broad drug categories, you need to regulate
like some stimulants, some
you need to,
psychedelics.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So we've focused on that, and we've done a lot of detailed modeling. We've drawn on the literature from alcohol regulation and tobacco regulation and pharmaceutical regulation and regulation of other risk behaviors like gambling or sex work or risky sports and all kinds of things, drawn on that regulatory literature and scholarship, and modeled what regulation would look like for different drugs. And then we produced those things and we put them in books. We make those books available for free in different languages online. And we use that to inform the debate going forward. So because no one had, feel free to wave them around.
Yeah, I wanted to show because Steve came to the podcast today, and then instead of me giving you a gift, you came with super nice gifts. So books like How to Regulate Stimulants, How to Regulate Cannabis, and How to Regulate Psychedelics.
Yeah,
practical guides.
You'll notice that there's a pattern there.
Yeah, but yeah.
And I have to be honest, these are really boring books. They're technical handbooks for regulating a risky product or a risky behavior. There are chapters in there about packaging. There are chapters in there about tax. There's chapters about licensing of venues, and because you need all that boring technocratic detail if you're going to do something like regulate a drug, particularly if you're regulating a risky drug. It is quite a boring technocratic exercise, in the same way as regulating power tools or regulating cars or regulating, fire retardant foam in these chairs. All the risks around us are regulated. The plugs that your podcast equipment is plugged into are regulated so that they don't catch fire. And like I say, the foam in the chair is regulated so that if it does catch fire, it doesn't create smoke and kill us. Regulation of risk is all around us, but we have this one little group of products and behaviors, illegal drugs, which is not regulated at all. And the problem with that is it doesn't stop people taking those drugs. It just makes them way more dangerous and creates all these harms for everybody else in terms of the illegal market and the crime and the violence and the street dealing and all the rest of the problems that impact not just people who use drugs, but the whole community. So what we did was to model. We spent, a lot of time, years really, modeling what regulation would look like for different drugs. And there was a gap in the debate, not just in the UK but internationally, for that. There was a need for that internationally, and so our books and our work started to find an audience internationally, and so our work basically spread out beyond the UK. And as a result, a lot of our books have been translated by other organisations and by other groups and by other governments into other languages. So a lot of those books are available. They're all available in Spanish. The stimulants book is also available in Portuguese and French. The cannabis book was translated into German to inform the German debate that's going on around cannabis legalization, and then a few random ones. The cannabis book's also been translated into Indonesian, and the stimulant and Thai. So it's been a really rewarding exercise, because it was like, okay, so and there was nothing clever in the work that we did. It wasn't like we had some genius idea. We didn't invent regulation. And we didn't invent the idea of regulating drugs either. The people have been talking about this for ages. I think if we did a clever thing, we actually did the work, because to get all that sort of regulatory thinking and workshop it for different drugs and write it down in a kind of coherent, structured way in a book, it's a lot of work.
I bet, and so helpful for civil society and legislators all across the world.
Yeah, so and the nice thing about those books now, I think, and the work that Transform has done, is that if someone is making a case, sort of like for, say, regulating cocaine, which is it's a hard thing to get your head around. But it's like, well, cocaine's really dangerous. Why would you legalize and regulate it? And the answer obviously is, well, millions of people, hundreds of millions of people are doing it anyway. And you either regulate it to reduce the risks that it causes, both to users and the community, or you leave it with Pablo Escobar and the cartels and all the chaos and violence and horrible shit that happens in Colombia and West Africa and on the streets of Oslo and everywhere else. But if you say something like that, people go, well, how are you going to do that? And you can go, well, look, there is some really thoughtful, structured, academic work on this. Here you go, and you can say to people, do you want to do it like this, or how who do you want selling cocaine? And they'll say, well, I don't want anyone selling it. So, well, we live in the real world. Someone's going to be selling it. Whether you like, it's not about I like cocaine or I approve of cocaine or I want people to take cocaine. It's like people are taking cocaine. That's the world we live in, and we have a responsibility as policymakers to deal with reality. And the reality is millions of people are taking cocaine and other drugs, and we can't just abandon them, and we can't just put them all in prison. We can, about a third of the population have used an illegal drug in most countries. I don't know, maybe it's a quarter. Are you going to put a third of the people in prison forever? What are you even talking about? And it's one of the questions I like to ask the politicians. Is like when or to people when they say, well, you want to legalize cocaine or you want to legalize MDMA, and I'm like, yes, I do. And they go, well, why would you do that? So I'm like, well, who do you want selling it? Who do you want? It's a good question to ask them, and if they say nobody, it's like, well, that's not the world we live in. The world we live in is someone is going to be selling it, and we either do that in a regulatory way with responsible government agencies trying to reduce risks, or you give all the responsibility to criminal profiteers, and then you take all the shit that comes with that. And we know what that looks like because that's the world we live in now. So let's do things differently. It's not that difficult.
Yeah, and I think it's important because this work, this theoretical academic work, stuff is already happening across the world, like actually happening. Reform is happening on all continents.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would say to people, go and read these really boring 400-page books, regulation, and these books are almost like aggressively boring, because they're not. These aren't books that you would buy in an airport and read in a hammock on the beach on your holiday. They're books for civil servants who are writing policy and building an institution from scratch to regulate a risky drug. And it seems to have worked, because when various governments have come to the point where they're ready to make that step, Transform and our other colleagues who do this work, it's not just Transform, we're contact. We'll get a call from the government of wherever it is, Luxembourg, and say, we want to regulate cannabis now. We're ready. Can you come and help us?
Yeah.
And it's been really, and that has been very satisfying if you're doing advocacy work. When you do advocacy work and you move from shouting at governments and just saying stop being so fucking stupid, and eventually they go, okay, what do we do now? And you go, all right, cool, let's have a meeting. And you sit down, and then you move from a campaigning role kind of to a consultancy role. And we've been invited to sit down with governments and design a new regulatory system, literally draft legislation. So and the first time that happened was Uruguay.
And when was that?
2012.
Yeah.
So 13 years ago now. And it was a big moment for us, because we'd already been working on this stuff for like 14 years or something, and written the books, and certainly the cannabis book, but not the other ones at that point. And it's kind of like, it's frustrating, if you're just banging away, if you feel like you're smashing your head against the wall, and then that change happens where a government goes, okay, we're going to do it. And that way, interestingly, that was a rare example of principled leadership at the top. I mean, there were activists pushing and informing it for sure, big civil society push in Uruguay, but it was one president, Mujica, who died actually this year, very sadly. President Mujica, who was a true leader, because he was like, I'm gonna do the right thing. And Mujica was amazing. He legalized gay marriage, abortion, and cannabis in Uruguay during his presidency, even though he had no popular mandate for any of those, because he thought it was the right thing to do. And imagine that, a leader showing actual leadership and doing unpopular things because he thought it was the right thing to do. But then they were unpopular in 2012. Now they have a majority because everyone is been persuaded that they were the right thing to do. Now they are popular. That's real leadership.
Yeah.
But that, I think after Uruguay, there was then this sort of cascade of reforms with cannabis stuff around the world, and it's been a real privilege to be involved in some of those changes. We haven't really done much in the US because it had its own sort of ecosystem of activists and experts in the US, and there was a big medical cannabis thing. So there was already a sort of regulatory expertise and activist networks there. But we worked in Canada with the Federal Task Force on the Canadian system. We helped get the reforms over the line in Mexico, although those have kind of stalled a bit. Weren't really involved in the stuff in South Africa, but amazing that reforms are happening in South Africa. Again, on every continent. And Thailand, again, there are things that we weren't involved in Thailand either, but where we have been involved is in a lot of the stuff that's happening in Europe. So we worked in Luxembourg and Malta, and our book was translated into German and helped inform the German. And we were involved with some of the consultations and policy design in Germany and Switzerland and the Netherlands and hopefully Norway.
Yeah, hopefully soon.
I think you might be surprised.
Yeah, I think like with decriminalization, everything happens so fast.
Right.
So even though right now, I think in this period in the government, it's not they don't have enough votes to do it. But yeah, things can happen really fast.
Everywhere that cannabis reforms have happened, it's taken people by surprise. And I think we're so used to the idea of that can never happen, that's impossible, and you hear people say it all the time, well, that'll never happen. Okay, that'll never happen, and then it does. And if you think about, I don't know what the reforms around gay marriage were in Norway, but in the US and in the UK, and in my experience with that was something, well, that's never going to happen, and then it just happened. And now, within a year or two after it, people are looking back going, what, did we used to criminalize? That used to be illegal? What on earth were we thinking? And things can move very, very quickly. And with the cannabis reforms, I didn't predict Uruguay. I kind of saw Canada was coming, but they had a kind of medical semi-decrim thing beforehand. Luxembourg, Malta, these came completely out of the blue for many of us. Even people who are in that world and moving in those political circles at the EU and the UN forums, it was really surprising. And things that seem impossible suddenly become possible, and then suddenly become a reality, and then really quite soon afterwards, you're looking back and going, what was that about? We used to criminalize that? You didn't used to be able to, marry whoever you wanted, or have, it's actually quite surprising how quickly things can move. And I think what happens is you approach a kind of threshold or a tipping point where public opinion is edging towards a majority, and media opinion is beginning to get behind something, and politicians are kind of increasingly in private going, yeah, I think we need to do this, but we're not quite ready politically yet, And then suddenly a threshold is reached. And you saw that very much in the US. It was basically when support for cannabis legalization in US states reached a majority, it cleared 50%, particularly when it cleared 50% amongst conservatives and Republicans. There was no stopping it. It had to change. And all the politicians were like, oh, hang on. I can win votes with this instead of losing votes with this. And everything changed really quickly. And so after Colorado in 2012, 12 years later, there's 23 states. And most of them have been by ballot, by votes, popular votes. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good. But you can see more as a political process, how things can change quite fast, and then you get a kind of domino effect, a cascade effect.
I know here in Norway already we had like a survey where it said that above 50% thought that cannabis should not be punished. So here it's also like moving more progressively with the people.
Right.
And I think it's really important as well to know that the other countries in the world that have done these reforms, they don't want to go back.
No.
And that
they generally get more support once they're in place, and people see them in action. And if more than 50% of people in Norway think that cannabis users shouldn't be punished, if you can't do follow-on questions in these things. But if you said to them, and where do you think they should get their cannabis from?
Yeah, I think it's soon we should probably try to get a survey done to ask more questions to see how the popular opinion is changing.
But the tricky thing with that is it's often about the wording of the questions. If you say, should we legalize cannabis? People might think, well, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Does that mean that you could buy cannabis in corner shops? Children could buy it, like really strong cannabis? What does it mean? So I think the way to do that is to have a proposal for a very responsibly regulated market, that doesn't look like the alcohol market or the tobacco market of the past. Maybe it's a government monopoly sales, or non-branded packaging, and you would ban advertising, and it'd be more like the restrictions we have around smoking. So people who want cannabis can get it and they can consume it in private, but you would have controls on public use, and you would think about what are people's concerns and fears, and respond to them. Have a set of proposals and say, would you support this? Because if you just say, do you want to legalize cannabis, people will think, oh, that means what? So people driving the school bus are going to be smoking cannabis on, with the bus. Their mind will fill with, myths and fears of the past.
Yeah.
And people who oppose it will stoke those fears. They'll exaggerate things, and they'll say, yes, they're going to sell cannabis gummy bears in sweet shops, and children will eat them and die and drown in the harbour. And you have to have a responsible set of proposals so that adults can have access to these things in a controlled way, with information about the dosage, with information about the risk and how to use these things responsibly. And you have to have investment in public risk education, like we do with tobacco. And look, tobacco is bad for you, gives you lung cancer, gives you heart disease. Cannabis is maybe not so bad, but there are risks. You don't smoke cannabis and drive. Don't smoke cannabis if you're pregnant. Don't whatever. Yeah. If you've got some certain mental health vulnerabilities, you probably shouldn't be smoking cannabis every day. Don't mix cannabis with alcohol. And basic health messages. If you have a regulatory system, there are ways to get those messages to people, which is really hard when it's illegal.
Yeah.
So all of that stuff, if you do those things in the right way, then those key constituencies, those key communities and key groups who are scared about change, scared about reform, scared of a legal market, scared of ending the war on drugs, you reassure them. And it makes the political process of delivering that change much easier. And once you're across the line, maybe you can relax things a bit. Maybe you could have whatever. You could have some marketing or some branded products, or maybe you could have edible products, or whatever. You start with a more conservative, restrictive model, and then maybe relax it when it's shown to work. It's much harder, as we've seen with tobacco. If you have a very laissez-faire liberal model with branded products and sports sponsorship and a sponsorship of music events and things like we still do with alcohol. We really shouldn't, but we do. It's very hard to rein it back, because especially if you have big, powerful corporations with lots of money controlling the market, they can then control the policy process with their money, with their lobbying, with their legal challenges, with their funding of political parties or individual politicians. They can start to control the politics because they're so rich. And you see this with alcohol and tobacco. It's really, really hard to do anything with alcohol and tobacco because the 4 or 5 big companies that control most of the global market they've got more money than most governments.
Yeah, this is a positive thing when we get to regulation of cannabis, that we get the chance to do something about those market functions.
Right.
But it's important to pay attention so we don't end up with like big cannabis.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really exciting when you're the legalization of cannabis and in the future of other drugs is an opportunity to design a market architecture which is more. You can embed social justice, you can embed equity, you can embed environmental protections. You can do things differently and better and actually show leadership about how markets should work that meet the needs of the whole community and not just a small number of rich corporate shareholders. To me, that's a really exciting opportunity that has much bigger implications across politics. And, I don't want to sound like a sort of communist or anything, but it's more about just that there is clearly a problem when you have big transnational corporates dominating any particular market. And I think the idea of having a more diverse market with space for small and medium-sized businesses that is more equal, that supports participation in the market of communities who've been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, that embeds environmental protections, that embeds human rights, that embeds a sort of social justice ethos. That's a good thing. Everyone should support that. We don't want, Starbucks. We don't want Molson and British American Tobacco and, Diageo and these massive mega corporations that control alcohol and tobacco taking over the cannabis market. But that is happening.
Yeah.
Diageo, British American, yeah, it's really happening.
But in the US, is that where it's going on, or is it going on?
It's happening in North America.
Yeah,
for sure. So Diageo and British American Tobacco, they are investing billions. The big alcohol and tobacco companies are investing billions in cannabis companies now, and they are masters of the dark arts in terms of controlling the policy-making process, bending and shaping legislation to serve their interests, to maximize their profits. They don't give a shit about the environment or public health or human rights or social justice, or they don't care about any of that. They might pretend to sometimes, but they are only interested in maximizing their profits. And they need to be kept a million miles away from the cannabis industry. But you see, but if we're writing legislation and designing this from scratch, we can write into the legislation that alcohol and tobacco companies are not welcome. They're not allowed to invest. And you can say no one company can have more than 3 licenses or have more than 3 stores, or no one company or one entity can have more than 1% of the market, or whatever. We have to design those rules. And there are good models for that. This isn't a new thing that we're inventing. Antitrust, anti-monopoly policies are hardwired into the law and all kinds of things. So we can do this, we can do things differently and better. But we need to seize that opportunity now, because the change is happening now. And if we're not doing that now, then we have to then try and retrofit and re-engineer it in the future, which is much, much more difficult. So people need to be engaged in those debates now about how we design a new market architecture. And this is a multi-billion dollar industry we're talking about. The US cannabis industry is worth 20-30 billion a year already. And we're also talking about loads of tax revenue for governments, which, again, instead of profits going to organised crime groups, some of the profits can go to the government and be reinvested back in impacted communities. So there's amazing potential to do amazing things with this, but we need to seize that opportunity now. Otherwise, it will just disappear into the same iniquitous corporate models that define so many other industries.
And we need to have these conversations as well, because up until recently, at least here in Norway, when cannabis regulation has been discussed, it's only been like whether we should do it or not. But it's time to discuss how. And I think for a lot of politicians, the intricacies and all the nuances that they have to pay attention to in order to make this right, I don't think they're aware at this point, but we're going to try to make them aware.
Yeah, and I actually think it's a really good advocacy strategy, is to try and ask the questions, let's if you say to abolition, let's get past the should we or shouldn't we thing. If you were going to regulate cannabis, how would you do it? Would you want a government state monopoly, maybe non-profit associations? Would you want to sort of build in environmental controls into the legislation from the start? How would you deal with issues around marketing and advertising? How would you deal with issues around public consumption? And it's a really good strategy because it forces the discussion into that space, and it makes them think about and talk about how we do it right, instead of, well, should we or shouldn't we, or is cannabis good or bad, or should people be doing it? It's like you move the debate into the reality of the need for change, but what the change looks like specifically. And it's actually quite a good advocacy strategy. And the debate does need to be there. You're absolutely right. It's not should we legalize and regulate. It's how do we do it? How do we do it right? How do we do it right in the way that meets the needs of all the different communities and stakeholders? And how do we balance those often conflicting needs? Because it's not always easy. Different groups will have different visions of what a legal cannabis market would look like.
Yeah, and the conversation about like how to do it is of course like starting to appear in many places around the world. But I also think it's interesting that some countries have even started to have conversations about how to regulate other things.
Yeah.
For instance, I thought you said that in Switzerland they're having trials on regulating cocaine. Is that right?
I mean, there are some municipal governments are trying to do pilot projects in Bern in Switzerland, which is I think it's the capital of Switzerland. The municipal government wants to do a trial of regulated a scientific experiment of regulated cocaine for recreational non-medical use. As a way of addressing street crime and enhancing public health. The problem they have is that the federal government is saying, no, what are you mad? No. But also in Amsterdam, the mayor of Amsterdam has been talking about this and trying to develop a set of proposals around regulating MDMA and regulating cocaine. For the same reasons, it'd like to enhance public health, to reduce social nuisance, to reduce organised crime activity and violence, which is a big problem in the dock areas. A lot of the cocaine into Europe comes into Amsterdam and Rotterdam, so they have a particular issue around the ports. And the MDMA thing, a lot of the MDMA in Europe is made in the Netherlands, and there's a lot of the industrial waste byproducts from that production is just dumped in rivers and forests, and it's polluting the environment. So there are these particular local concerns that they're responding to, and there's a very active debate, unsurprisingly perhaps, on cocaine regulation in Colombia. And Colombia was the first place where there was a bill tabled in the Senate to regulate the coca leaf that the drug comes from, but is used traditionally in the Andes, to regulate cocaine powder. A pilot project to regulate cocaine powder for adult use, and a harm reduction model for people who smoke crack cocaine or inject cocaine. So there was a very comprehensive model that was tabled in the Senate, and the person who is now the president of Colombia was part of the health committee that promoted that, and he spoke in favor of it and voted for it. So you have a head of state now in Colombia who openly supports responsible regulation of the entire cocaine supply chain, and has spoken about it. He stands up at the General Assembly at the UN in New York and says the war on drugs has failed. We need to explore regulation. Cocaine is less dangerous than whiskey. How dare you, force us to have a war on drugs? So that debate, even on something as in the public mind as threatening as cocaine, is moving forward.
Yeah, because that's what I wanted to comment a little bit on, because cocaine is in Norway, cocaine right now is the thing that we're fearing the most in the media. That's getting way more media attention than other types of overdose deaths, for instance. Cocaine is what we're concerned about.
What, cocaine use or cocaine markets?
Cocaine use is what we're concerned about, not the cocaine markets, really. And especially concerned that young people are using it. But when it comes to regulation of cocaine, we know that having cocaine together with alcohol increases the risk of both drugs. Mm-hmm. Isn't it to play like the devil's advocate, isn't it like irresponsible in a way to like supply people with both those drugs at the same time? Also, like knowing that like violence is a problem when those drugs are combined, and like both in the UK and Norway, people drink so irresponsibly already.
Yes, I mean co-use of cocaine and or other amphetamines and stimulants with alcohol is a big problem because you end up doing more of both of them. Essentially, the cocaine, people have you can drink more because the stimulant effects, and when you drink more, it can reduce your judgment, and you do cocaine to it's a problem. And cocaine use and alcohol use are very much linked together. But that is happening now under Prohibition. So it's like, well, how is Prohibition stopping that? And the answer is it's not. So again, I would say we have that is a reality that we need to accept is something that is happening, and we try and manage it to reduce the problems it causes. Prohibition does not facilitate management of that problem. It makes it more difficult. In many ways, you could say it encourages it. So I think if you were going to have, and we do talk about this particular specific issue in the book, because cocaine and alcohol, they combine in your body to create a drug called cokeethylene, which is a separate drug to either of them, and it is psychoactive in itself. It is perhaps more toxic to the body. It may be more addictive than either of them. It's a problem. So people can become sort of addicted to cocaine and alcohol together, and that becomes a thing in itself. But I think you could use regulation to try and separate those markets. So you could have venues where cocaine use was permitted, but that didn't have alcohol, or that only had low alcohol beers, for example.
Yeah, but do you think anyone would be like, in my understanding from the literature, alcohol and cocaine goes so much together that no one is like really using cocaine on its own? Do you think people would be interested in using cocaine?
I mean, I
like
think,
that?
but I think you could also, what you have to do is you have to give people information and encourage them to make responsible choices. And generally speaking, if people understand risks, they will behave more rationally in relation to that. Now, if we invested some serious resources in educating people about the risks of co-use of alcohol and cocaine and young people, I think they would make more responsible choices. Young people, I don't need to tell you this, but young people are not stupid. And if they have the right information, they're very capable and willing and keen to make sensible choices. No one wants to get addicted. No one wants to get hurt. No one wants to end up in hospital. No one wants to die. And if you give people the right information, they will make the right choices. I don't think I've ever seen any public information campaigns, drug information about alcohol and cocaine used together. I've never seen it. I've never seen it in a bar. Yes, if you go to some harm reduction websites, you can find some stuff about it, but I've never seen any public advocacy campaigns or public health campaigning about that particular issue. But it's quite a big issue. So we're just missing a trick here. A public health approach to this problem would identify a risk behavior and a risk population and target them with resources. And those resources would be information and services for people who are having problems. So, you need to have dedicated services for people who are using those drugs together and having problems with it. You need to remove the criminalization so that people aren't fearful of approaching services to talk about it. And if they get information messages from government-related sources, that they trust them. Young people won't trust the government on something on drugs information if the government is also trying to arrest them and punish their ass and put them in jail. So if we move from there's no miracle solution to that particular problem or any problem. But I feel that criminalization of use and prohibition of supply only makes it worse, and it makes doing the things that we know might work or could work more difficult, and it drains resources from them. So a pivot towards public health, generally you invest in the things that we know work: public health education, responsible regulatory markets. I mean, in terms of there are things that you definitely wouldn't do. like have alcoholic drinks with cocaine in them. You wouldn't sell those things together. You wouldn't ever have sales of cocaine in bars. I think it would be perfectly reasonable to say that alcohol establishments don't allow cocaine consumption on them. I don't have a problem with that. I don't. Or you could have cocaine-friendly environments that didn't have alcohol or had low level or only had like low alcohol beers, for example. There are things you could do. You could try. It's very much uncharted territory. Would those things work? I don't know. Should we try them and find out if they work? Yeah, definitely.
One more thing that I think is like uncharted work a little bit. I'm interested in Baden, for instance, in Switzerland. Do you if they were to supply like regulated cocaine, where would they get that cocaine from? Would they do it like synthetically, or would they get it from like South America? Because it doesn't like it grows like in South America only, right? You can't get it. Can you get it like in a greenhouse?
You can grow it anywhere.
In a greenhouse?
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't know.
No.
Maybe they needed like some rainforest magic.
Yeah, there's a bit of a myth that coca only grows in the mountain in the Andes. No, you can grow it anywhere.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
And there is some coca leaf was traditionally grown in Indonesia and Java. There's been some coca grown in Central African regions. There's a lot of coca being grown in Ecuador now. That is still Latin America for sure, but. There is a legal cocaine market already for medical use. People aren't really aware of it, but the coca is grown in, let me get this right, in Peru, under government monopoly. The leaves are harvested. The leaves are shipped to the US by the DEA, by the Drug Enforcement Agency, administration. The cocaine is removed and sold on the medical market as a local anesthetic and vasoconstrictor. The biggest importer is the UK. I have no idea why. The leaves that have the cocaine removed are then sold to the Coca-Cola company to make Coca-Cola.
Really?
Yeah. So there's no cocaine left, but it's in the name of the drink, Coca.
Yeah.
Cola.
Yeah,
the coca bit is the coca leaf. Coca-Cola still has coca leaf in it.
I thought that was like what they did in the past, and then they just kept it.
No, in the past the cocaine was in there as well.
Yeah, with actual cocaine. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but this is back in the 1890s. There was still cocaine in Coca-Cola, but there was a bit of a panic at one of these early drug panics was around cocaine use. So they took the cocaine out and they put caffeine in instead. But the coca leaf is still in there.
Yeah.
And the Coca-Cola company is the biggest purchaser of the coca leaf in the world. They're legal. But the cocaine is extracted as a pharmaceutical alkaloid and made into medical cocaine, which goes mostly to Europe. It's not. I don't think it's allowed in the US, but it's used as for eye surgery and ENT surgery in the UK and Switzerland. So you can get cocaine legally in the international market for medical use. And I think the idea would be for the pilot, you would use that, but you would, instead of medical use, it would be for scientific use. And this would be it's a bit of a legal finesse, a little bit of a legal bullshit, really. But if you say it is for a scientific experiment, the argument is that you can then it's allowable under international law, because cocaine is prohibited for non-scientific and medical uses. And if you say it's a scientific use, I'm not sure I buy that as an argument. But if it works to move the debate forward, great. So that would be, I think, how they do it. Or they would just make it. They would just grow coca themselves in Switzerland. But that would and provide. But they would probably be in breach of international law. But then so is every legal cannabis jurisdiction is in breach of international law and the treaties. But the treaties were being written in the 40s and 50s. They're from another age. These creaky old arcane prohibitionist laws from 70, 80 years ago. Unfortunately, that is still the legal bedrock of global prohibition, even though the world is completely different from the world in the 1940s and 50s when those laws are being drawn up. And we've had 70, 80 years of abject failure to show us that as a policy model that doesn't work. I don't need to revisit that. I've already ranted about it. But more and more countries are moving away from the very strict prohibitionist tenets of the international law and the UN drug treaties. They're just like, look, these treaties, they don't work for us anymore. If they ever did, they don't work for us. We can't be a party to them anymore. And they are defecting, soft defections, hard defections. People are, Canada legalized cannabis. They're not allowed to do that.
But has there been any consequences for the countries who have?
Well, I mean, the thing about, I don't want to get too much into international law, but the nature of international law is different from state level sovereign lawmaking in that the power of international law is that parties, member states at the UN level who agree to abide by it. And its power comes from the consensus and agreement around an international law. If countries start ignoring it or breaching it, its power weakens. In terms of enforcement mechanisms, it's very difficult. The international law is quite difficult to enforce. You can have economic sanctions or diplomatic consequences. It's only at the very, very extremes where like a UN peacekeeping force would enter something, and the UN is not going to send in UN peacekeepers to shut down
that would be quite a sight.
Cannabis shops in Canada or Uruguay. So essentially, their main tool is for the International Narcotics Control Board, which is the body that kind of polices the treaties, if you like, is a sort of watchdog of the treaties. If a country is breaching or threatening to breach or in non-compliance with their treaty obligations, the INCB goes, naughty, you're very, very naughty. And that's basically it.
Yeah.
So the INCB to Uruguay and Canada has gone, no, you're naughty. And Uruguay and Canada just went, fuck off, don't care.
Yeah, and I guess that's like, and I don't really have enough like competence to really talk about this for long, but for drug regulation, that is like, like positive if you're part of like the drug policy progressive movement, that you can just like, it's not going to be like any consequences like that, but with the like international law in general, it's being attacked by like so many countries are in non-compliance.
It's not without and we all sort of smile and laugh and go, oh, haha, Uruguay, they just naughty, they did it anyway, yay, isn't that great? Actually, it's not that great because international law is really important, and we wouldn't want, if when China violates its international human rights obligations, we don't laugh that off. That's serious, and there is a genuine danger that if countries are undermining the UN treaties and law more around drugs, that undermines the whole system of international law more broadly, and that is a concern.
Both broadly, but also like in drug policy, where we have countries that are executing people for drug use.
Exactly.
So we definitely don't want them to do that.
They do say, and so. At the UN, and we've been to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, and you've heard those debates. We were probably sat next to each other. When China or Russia say to Canada, and this has literally happened, don't you lecture us on international human rights law when you're violating the treaties right now? And Canada's kind of like, oh, it's quite hard to come back to that. And when Russia is violating the international ballistic missile treaties, when China is, executed, Singapore and Singapore's said this as well. Don't lecture us about international law. You're breaking the law. And China and Russia and Singapore are calling out Uruguay and Singapore, Canada, at the UN for being in breach of international law, and this is a real problem. I mean, I think there are things those countries can do to try and mitigate those risks. They acknowledge that they were in non-compliance. They've said we are seeking remedies to bring ourselves back into compliance. We acknowledge these tensions. And there may be mechanisms. We don't have to go too far into this, but there may be mechanisms and legal remedies they can do to sort of reduce those tensions. But these things are a real problem, and the treaty system when you have a malfunctioning, arcane system that no longer meets the needs of member states and has to change, has to modernize, has to evolve, it's really difficult for that to happen, just because with the UN, everything is driven by consensus. Everyone has to, if you want to change a treaty or write a new treaty, everybody has to agree to it. And there is such polarized views on drugs between these legalization states and these, you can get executed in Singapore for things that are completely legal in Canada now. You can, I think 500 grams of cannabis resin, death penalty in Singapore. In Canada, nothing. You can sell it in a shop. And so there's such a distance between the so polarized, these extremes of the reformers and the pragmatic reformers and the sort of old school status quo. It's very difficult to know how to resolve things. And in terms of getting agreement for changing international law, it's almost impossible. So then there's a lot of discussions about how we can move forward with that. We don't have to talk about that.
Yeah, and I think just like as a last comment, I think it's important also to recognize that at these like major conventions where the member states meet and they discuss, it's not only about drug policy at all.
No.
No. It's major politics about like wars.
There's all kinds of proxy things going on. And, there was loads of when the Ukraine thing happened, there was loads of sort of Ukraine-related Russia tensions. With Gaza, there's been lots of tensions between pro and anti-states. So these things play out, and you're right, it's nothing to do with drug policy.
And at the last CND, it was the US suddenly because of their identity politics.
Oh my God, they were being absolute morons.
They couldn't agree to anything that mentioned like women or
any mention of women, human rights, the WHO, or the Sustainable Development Goals. And you're just like, you're what? And they were saying they were standing up and saying obnoxious MAGA bullshit that would have been. It was unbelievable. There was these kind of redneck morons on the floor of the UN saying, I believe that there are two sexes, a man and a woman. We're not going to get dragged into this gender ideology. And you're like, what are you? This isn't Fox News. This is not some idiot fucking redneck podcast. This is the UN. You can't come and bitch about the Sustainable Development Goals that US was very central to writing and signed up to. I mean, it was so weird.
It is weird.
It was so weird, but I don't know. It's difficult to know how to feel about those things. You kind of almost feel like those international institutions are kind of collapsing, because how is it sustainable when you have these idiots just saying this obnoxious stuff that's such an anathema to anything about the UN principles and the UN Charter, and refusing to use human rights language. It's like, this is the UN. What's her name? Eleanor Roosevelt wrote the Human Rights Charter. What are you even talking about? It was very, very weird. We are in strange times. We're at strange times, dark times. I think the rise of anti-immigrant populism and sort of Trumpism and the sort of MAGA culture war stuff. It's this is the fight of our lives, and drug policy almost seems irrelevant in some of this. And in a way, I'm pleased that drug policy hasn't really got dragged into the culture wars too much. It's still quite a non-partisan position. You have people on the right and left who support and oppose different drug policy reform positions, which is a good thing.
Yeah, I know here in Norway there are some politicians who are trying to make it into like identity politics, but across the world it's
well, it's interesting how that hasn't really happened. I mean, at the last election, Kamala Harris and Trump were supporting cannabis legalization, which was like, there's almost nothing I could support Trump on, but it was just a relief that it didn't become an issue. It wasn't an election issue because there wasn't really that much division between them. So no one was talking about it, which is kind of good. Maybe it would have been good if they had been talking about it, but if it gets dragged into culture wars, it's going to make life a lot more difficult.
Well, we at least know that Trump, even though he's like positive to or not opposed or whatever, he's like changing his mind.
He supported the Florida initiative.
Yeah. So that's good.
Which
but
failed.
At the same time,
and then the weed got more votes than Trump in Florida, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah.
I think the weed initiative got 57% and Trump got 54 or something, which I thought was quite even in Florida, which is let's face it, kind of a strange place at the best of times.
Yeah, because what I wanted to say was like in like Trump or the US recently, they've been like shooting up boats, right? Outside of Venezuela. Yeah, so that's like huge part of that's like intensifying the drug war.
Yeah, but also completely illegal under international law. Yeah, you can't just go and.
No,
governments can't do extrajudicial murder on international seafaring in territory. Absolutely, I mean, murder. It's murder. It's not. And they were going. They're drug dealers. Were they?
Yeah.
And right. Okay. Firstly, even if they were, you still don't get to just kill them. And secondly, you don't even know that. And even if they were drug dealers, they would have just been like, poor people who've been drawn. The bottom of the sort of hierarchy, people who've been drawn into illegal activities because as a form of economic survival. As most people at the lower end of drug markets, they get drawn into working in illegal drug markets as a form of economic survival. It's a survival economy, and it's often the poorest people, immigrants, people who are displaced, people who are trying to, it's a horrible term, but drug mules, the people who are smuggling drugs, often women, just trying to feed their children. They're like, I can't survive. I've been offered $5,000 to take this suitcase to Norway. I'll do that, and then they end up in prison for massive drug smuggling for like 25 years, and their lives are ruined, and their children's lives are ruined. It's like they're not
part of it at all.
No, they're being exploited.
Yeah, and if they didn't do it, someone else would do it.
I mean, maybe these guys on the boat were horrible, violent drug dealers. You still don't get to just execute them arbitrarily without any evidence. And apparently they'd even turned around and were heading back, and they just blew them up anyway. Unbelievable. They really the American government needs to be prosecuted for this. They need to be held to account for murder. It's illegal in multiple laws were breached with that, and they need to be called out for it. You can't just go drug war or the war on drugs and the war before, the war on terrorism, the war on terror. These were used as a pretense to justify all kinds of illegal, otherwise unjustifiable political activity by the US and to be fair, other countries. It wasn't just the US, but mostly the US. And the US are now, they're by designating cartels as terrorist organizations, they've effectively, and because they have this very broad sweeping powers for anti-terror legislation, they've effectively green-lighted military interventions into Mexico. And you're like, wow, is this where we are? And you think that, you think dropping a few cluster bombs on some cartels' houses and killing all their families or whatever the hell they're going to do, is that going to stop the drugs? No, of course it's not. Each time you take out one cartel, another one just goes, yay, opportunity. We'll have that market. Thank you very much. Yeah. The idea that the stupid idea that you can somehow stop drugs coming across the border by building a wall. Yeah. It's like a wall. And also, they have tunnels. They have drones. They have catapults. They have
submarines.
They have submarines.
Yeah.
The drug submarines. I think it's really it's kind of the ultimate sort of symbol of the idiocy of the war on drugs. It's like they have built massive stealth submarines that can go from Brazil all the way to Europe, all the way to Spain and Galicia. A lot of them are landing underwater with tons and tons of drugs in. And it's like, look, we caught one. Yeah, but you didn't catch the other 10. And they don't mind losing one. That's just like paying VAT. They don't give a shit. That's great.
It's so much money involved.
So much money, billions, trillions. I mean, one of the calculations in a recent report that I was working on was that the illegal drug market turns over $1 trillion a year, 1,000 billion. I mean, this is so much money. Catching a submarine or killing a few, makes no difference.
Yeah.
Even when they seize 50 tons of cocaine, they say we've prevented 50 tons of cocaine from reaching the streets. It's like, no, you haven't.
Yeah, and
drop in the ocean.
Except maybe perhaps for a while making it like more violent in those areas.
Yeah.
For instance, I read that when
the purity goes down for a few weeks, and people cut it with something else, and people get poisoned. It's like nothing good happened.
Yeah, because I remember reading how they closed some of the border entrances, so they wouldn't get they could check more of the drugs that came in, but instead you got like a massive cartel war that became a lot more bloodier on the Mexico side of the border.
I mean, Neil Woods, when you talk to him, he'll be talking about all this stuff. But even when enforcement is nominally successful, generally it'll either have bad public health consequences in terms of reducing purity and increasing adulteration, or it'll have bad market consequences in terms of increasing violence as different groups vie for control of the whatever the bit of the market that's just opened up. And yet on we go again and again, because politicians like the symbolism of we've arrested a drug dealer, we've seized a big pile of cocaine, we've blown up a boat full of drug terrorists. It's like those things give you they give you a short-term boost in the 24-hour news cycle, but they have zero impact on the overall global market. How are we doing? How are we doing for time?
I think we're running towards the end of our time.
I want to talk about the environment piece though.
So let's get to that one. Yeah, please.
Well, one of the things that I think, an area of work that we've been increasingly focusing on with a group called the Coalition for Environmental Justice and Drug Policy Reform, which is a group of NGOs and activists and artists and academics from around the world who are focused on the overlap between environmental justice and the war on drugs. And it cannot. For many people, it doesn't seem like an obvious connection. Well, what's the war on drugs got to do with climate mitigation or biodiversity protection? And the answer is actually a lot. And it's useful to kind of walk people through it. I think people are familiar with the idea that deforestation in the Amazon, we've talked about cocaine and the Andes, is happening because people are cutting down trees to grow illegal drugs, mostly coca and cocaine, but to some extent other drugs, opium and cannabis as well, but mostly coca. And there've been some campaigns in Europe, like every line of cocaine that you snort is a hectare of forest cut down or some such thing. Actually, that's not really the problem. That is not really the problem. The area under cultivation to produce the cocaine market, it's worth billions. It's actually very small. It's only you could grow all the coca that's consumed in the world in an area about 20 miles square. It's not that much. It's pretty small. It's only worth so much money because it's illegal. So a gram of cocaine that cost $1.50 to make sells for $100 when it gets to Europe, or $200 when it gets to Australia. And that's because of prohibition. So prohibition inflates the value and creates all the problems again. The problem of deforestation is made worse by eradication. So they fumigate or they manually eradicate the crops. That doesn't get rid of the crops, it just moves them. So people just go and cut down some more forest.
Yeah, and usually and they will move perhaps even more into the forest,
right.
away from the control of
exactly. So they go further into indigenous lands,
protected
areas and national parks. Because to get further away from the enforcement, so it really, really doesn't work, and it always makes things worse. So you push the problem around, or you mutate the problem in dangerous ways. But that isn't really the problem either. That is a problem, and it makes the problem worse of deforestation. But the real problem is that the profits that the cartels are making, the billions that they are making from this, because of the war on drugs and profit and the economic incentives that it creates. those billions are being reinvested and laundered through extractive industries in the Amazon. So I'm talking about illegal mining, illegal logging, illegal ranching of palm oil and soya and beef. That is, and they're making roads. They're cutting down millions of acres.
They're making like airstrips,
and they're cutting down millions and millions of acres for these extractive Amazonian industries. So a problem which is a small problem, deforestation to grow cocoa, which becomes a bigger problem with eradication, becomes 1,000 times bigger when those profits are being invested in genuinely destructive extractive industries. And that is the real problem. And arguably there's even a bigger problem, which is that to do those things, to control those regions, to grow the cocoa and to sort of facilitate the illegal extractive industries or quasi-legal. The ranching, some of it is legal, it's just money laundering. To facilitate that, you have to corrupt civic institutions. So the police, the judiciary, the forest control agencies, the environmental control agencies, you have to corrupt them or fight them with violence, which they do. And obviously these billion-dollar cartels have got way more money than these impoverished civic institutions, and they can corrupt them or they can threaten them with violence to bend them to their will. And the problem then is when you have no civic infrastructure of any kind, even if you want to do climate mitigation and biodiversity protection and prevent deforestation, you can't do it because there's no civic infrastructure to implement it. And in many cases, you can't even go there. You can't even get into these regions because they are controlled by armed groups that are either working with the cartels or are effectively have merged with the cartels, have become the cartels. So there's all sorts of armed groups with political agendas, and there are cartels with economic agendas, and over the years they've often sort of merged, and they control entire regions of the Amazon that are now being devastated at an accelerating rate. So, and this is the point, you cannot protect the Amazon, you cannot protect biodiversity, you cannot do climate mitigation in the Amazon in Andean region when you are also fighting a war on drugs, specifically a war on plants. The idea that you protect biodiversity by literally having a war on plants and creating a highly militarized conflict zone essentially controlled by non-state actors who have no interest in environmental protections at all. So the basic reality of this is that we cannot protect the Amazon whilst we're fighting a war on drugs in the Amazon, and we cannot meet the Sustainable Development Goals for the Amazon or globally if that is going on. And the funny thing is, you can explain this to people, and when you walk them through, they kind of go, "Yeah, wow, you've got a point. We haven't really thought about that." And this is even like Greenpeace and World Wildlife Foundation, and people who really should be engaged with this stuff and understand it better don't, and they never talk about drugs. Well, the big environmental agencies are just not talking about the war on drugs, even though there is a war on drugs happening in the Amazon, which is the region that they're obsessing about. The big Amazonian environmental groups, they're not talking about the war on drugs, or barely talking about it, because even if they understand it, you then have to go, okay, what do we do about it? And that the reflex for so many people, including way too many NGOs, is we need to have more policing and more military interventions. We need to fight the cartels harder. But the only way we can fight this and defeat them is more war on drugs. And you're like, no, there is no enforcement solution to this. The war on drugs and enforcement created this problem. More militarization is just going to cause more conflict, disruption. It will undermine civic institutions. It will hurt the most vulnerable populations, indigenous populations, peasant cocoa growers, farmers, economic people already socially and economically marginalized in working, living in these regions will be harmed more by increased violence and conflict between state and non-state actors. What you need to do is to legalize and regulate coca and cocaine. the entire supply chain. But that's such a sort of head fuck for people that and it's such a dangerous thought, sort of forbidden thing to say in NGO and high level forums. They're just not willing to go there. They're just terrified of even thinking it, let alone saying it, let alone actually planning and implementing it.
Yeah.
But that is what needs to happen. And the problem is, you need for it to happen. You don't just need to have all the environmental groups on board and all the public health groups and big development organisations. Oxfam, CAFOD, the big development agencies, the big government development, USAID, all these people. They all need to be part of this. But to do that, you need to legalise cocaine in Europe and North America, because those are the consumption and Brazil, where most of the cocaine consumption happens. And there's so many bits of that jigsaw that need to happen to move forward on this. It can almost seem impossible.
Yeah.
But, we have to start that discussion. We have to start it, because if we don't, the Amazon is doomed. It will be destroyed. And we'll be sitting in this, dystopian ashen wasteland of the Amazon in 20, 30 years going, oh, what happened? It's like, well, a war on drugs was definitely a big part of this. And, it's not like we didn't tell you. I don't want to have to be doing that. Well, what I want is for people to open their eyes, see that is a problem that has, and it's not the only problem. There are lots of multiple things, different things impacting on climate change and Amazon and biodiversity. But the war on drugs is a big part of it that has to be addressed if we're going to solve this, and nobody is talking about it. So even if all the other stuff works, all the other projects and stuff, and even if all of that other stuff happens, if the war on drugs is going, we're never gonna, we can't solve this problem. So I am genuinely afraid about this, and because it just seems, because cocaine legalization has to be part of the solution. And cocaine legalization is such a kind of mind-bending leap of faith for so many people who can't get their heads around it. It's really challenging. But that's why, at the very least, we need to be normalizing the discussion. We need to be making people appreciate this is something and get them thinking about, okay, if we were to legalize cocaine supply chain, what does that mean? What does it look like? How might that work? What are the steps to get there? Do we need pilot projects? Well, yes. Do we need individual countries to make that initiative, like Colombia? Yes. Do we need legal coca markets to sort of normalize coca? Do we maybe need to look at developing safer coca-based products that aren't the same as cocaine powder? Maybe coca lozenges, maybe like snus with coca leaf in it, maybe coca type Red Bull energy drinks. Maybe there are other things we could do that aren't as bad or threatening or scary as snorting cocaine powder or injecting or smoking crack. There are lots of things we could be doing to move forward, pilot projects, initiatives. But the key thing is we need to start that discussion. We need to acknowledge that this is a problem that is not going to go away and that there is no enforcement solution. And we need to start the discussion on what a post-cocaine prohibition world would look like. Because if we don't, the Amazon is fucked, not to be too blunt about it.
Yeah. This I first heard about this like nexus of climate policy and drug policy a couple years ago at Nordic Reform Conference. And to me, it was such a shock to see how important those things were for each other, but also really important because, in my opinion, the fight for climate justice is a lot more important than drug policy. And when those things like intersected, I'm like, yes, I can just keep working on drug policy, and we can do something for the climate as well.
A friend of mine, Damon Barrett, he was asked at a conference, the HRI conference a few years ago. Someone said, well, what about climate change? How does that intersect with drug policy stuff? And Damon quite rightly said, look, if we don't sort climate change out, we're all dead. And the drug policy reform is irrelevant. It doesn't matter if drugs are legal or not. If human life is not sustainable on the planet, absolutely. I don't think drug policy reform is the most important thing ever. Obviously, climate change is an immediate urgent existential threat to humanity, and it has to be a priority in all things. But I think the intersection is really, really important. People need to get their heads around it. We cannot meet our climate goals. We cannot meet our environmental sustainable development goals. We can't protect the biodiversity if we are still fighting a war on drugs in the most ecologically vulnerable parts of the world. And it's not just the Amazon, it's also Southeast Asia, it's also through the tropical regions of the whole world, actually, of Africa and Southeast Asia and Indonesia and so on. We can't achieve our sustainable development goals whilst we're fighting a war on drugs. And people really need to wake up to that. And deal with the logical consequences of it, which is we need to end the war on drugs, which means legalization and responsible regulation of drugs, including the ones that we find kind of scary, like cocaine and heroin, opium. Yeah, that really does have to happen. So I'm glad that you feel that way about it, because I think it would be really good for a lot of the youth movements who feel very passionate about environmental change and the much smaller youth movements, let's be honest, much smaller youth movements involved in drug law reform can come together and work on that. And I think the drug law reform youth movements need to be engaging with the environmental youth movements and saying, look, this is something we have to focus on. Yeah. All that other stuff you're doing will be for nothing if we don't end the war on drugs as well.
Yeah. So I'm really motivated for this topic. I think it's very important. And what we're doing first is, as you already mentioned, we're talking with Neil Woods on this podcast in October.
He's brilliant. He's a genius. And he's a really good speaker, and he comes from a position of knowledge and experience that I can't even aspire to, because he has fought the war on drugs himself and seen it fail. So he's amazing, and he's a brilliant speaker on this.
Yeah,
and he really understands the dynamics of international organized crime, corruption, and governance as well. So yes, he's brilliant.
Yeah. So we're going to talk more about what you talked about now at the end of this podcast, and we're also going to host an event here in Oslo that we think is going to be streamed as well. But more information about that is coming on our social media.
Cool.
But with that, I think it's time to wrap up this podcast.
No, I must rant more. There are more things I want to rant about. No, but thank you so much, and thanks for all the brilliant work you're doing.
Yeah.
It's just so important to have a vibrant, dynamic civil society pushing these things amongst different communities, whether it's the youth, whether it's families and parent groups, whether it's public health, whether it's the police, whether it's academia, whether it's amongst judiciaries, whether it's policymakers. We need to be engaging with all of these communities and getting them thinking about this stuff and talking about it. Because if there's one thing that all of my advocacy experience has pointed to, is that if you're having the debate around this, it only moves in one direction. The more people are exposed to information and discussion and debate on drug law reform, they only move one direction, and it isn't towards more war on drugs. It becomes obvious to anybody very quickly that the war on drugs is a terrible idea. And we need to shine a light on that. And and the work you're doing is very much doing that. So thank you so much.
Well, you can thank us, but we have to thank you. Like what the work that Transform has been doing, and all the times that you've come here to Norway and to help like this Nordic collaboration. And I think it was really nice. Yesterday was the Nordic Reform Conference. This podcast will probably be posted in a bit later than that. But it was really nice of you to say how important it is to collect or gather people from all of the Nordic countries to come together and discuss this, to feel they're part of like a larger movement and to get inspiration and share knowledge.
Yeah.
It's really important, and we always appreciate that you come here. And thanks for joining this podcast, even though your flight is like in a few hours.
Yeah, I need to get off to the airport.
Yeah, thank you so much.
No, my pleasure.